I am Dr. Victoria Stead at the Alfred Deakin Institute. I'm here today with Professor John Altman, Research Professor in Anthropology here in the Institute. John, you have a really long track record of doing work on issues related to Indigenous Australia, and particularly around the area of economic policy making. We're a couple of days out from a federal election, which means, of course, that we're a couple of days out from the beginning of a new term of government. There seems to have been very little said about Indigenous issues in this election campaign. Can you give us some idea as to why the silence?
Look, it's extraordinary silence. The anthropologist Bill Stanner talked about the great Australian silence in relation to Indigenous issues, Indigenous history, and you could say in this election we've seen a great Australian silence in relation to Indigenous policy. This is particularly surprising given that we had a Close the Gap report in February of this year that in fact shockingly showed that some of the key gaps were not closing. And the main gap, I suppose, that I focus on, which is the disparity in employment between Indigenous and other Australians, is in fact growing.
And one of the points that you make in your research is that, in fact, within this Close the Gap framework, there is no target for economic inequality. There is no target to close the economic gap. That seems staggering, really. But one of the areas, as you say, where there is some discourse is in relation to employment. But you're very critical about the ways in which employment is talked about in relation to Indigenous Australia, but also very critical of the kinds of policy that are being made in relation to Indigenous employment. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, we're measuring employment with standard social indicators, and so what we're really looking at is mainstream employment only. But of course, many Indigenous people live in regional or remote Australia, many live on Aboriginal-owned land, and the sorts of opportunities that they have out there are fundamentally different from those that the majority of Australians face. The thing is that what the measuring the employment gap does is give us a sense of the extent of Indigenous poverty. You're quite right that no government since Bob Hawke's in 1987 has been brave enough to look to eliminate income disparities between Indigenous and other Australians. But in some ways, employment is a proxy. And what it tells us is that if employment disparity is getting wider, then you can be sure that income inequality between Indigenous and other Australians is also growing.
John, you're part of an international network, Academics Stand Against Poverty, and in the lead up to the election, that network released a report entitled A Poverty Audit, 2016 Poverty Audit. And your contribution to that report, you look particularly at auditing Indigenous poverty. Within that report, you have scored the major parties, Labor and the Coalition, also the Greens. Can you talk a little bit about your findings from that scorecard?
Yes, the Academics Stand Against Poverty, Oceania, has done an audit across a whole range of areas, and I looked at Indigenous poverty. I looked at the performance of the Coalition over the last 3 years and scored them a very low 0. The highest score one can get is 4, on the grounds that things have actually appeared to have gotten worse in relation to poverty in the last 3 years, and that's mainly in relation to people losing their social security benefits, something we can talk a little bit more about. Labor, in terms of its proposals, is looking to improve things slightly, but again, when it was in office, it made no great inroads in Indigenous poverty, so I think I score them at about 1. But it's really the Greens that seem to have the more positive agenda. The Coalition's approach has really been to look to integrate Indigenous people into the mainstream labour market. But as the labour market has in fact tightened, what we're seeing is less and less Indigenous employment being created, and so Indigenous employment programs are looking to, if you like, have make work and training for Indigenous people. And in regional remote Australia, there's a program called the Community Development Program that's been an absolute disaster because while there are 37,000 jobless people on that program, 85% of whom are Indigenous, there's been very few what they call 26-week job outcomes from that program, about 6,000. But what we've seen is an extraordinarily high rate of people being breached. In other words, because this program is looking for people to work 5 hours a day, 5 days a week, year round for below award wages, people have become very reluctant to participate in the scheme. So we've seen 50,000 breaches of people in the second half of 2015. That's according to the government's own statistics.
That's an enormous number of breaches. How many people are we talking about there? How many participants are there in this scheme to account for such an extraordinarily high rate of breaching?
Well, Indigenous people constitute 3% of the Australian population, but 5% of the jobless. And they're attracting more than 50% of the breaches. In other words, Indigenous people are being breached at least 10 times, at least a 10 times higher rate than non-Indigenous people. And what the impact of breaching is, if you have a minor breach, you lose 1 day's income for 1 day's no-show at work. But after 3 strikes, you get a serious breach, and that means you get no income for 8 weeks. In other words, families dependent on welfare support are getting no cash income for 8 weeks. It's unimaginable for most Australians to think that people are trying to survive only through assistance from their wider kinship network.
Absolutely, 8 weeks is an enormous amount of time to go without any form of income support. You've made the point as well that this has devastating effects on families. So this is not simply individuals who are affected by these breaches, but entire families. And one would assume within remote communities, in fact, entire communities are really being affected by the impacts of this regime.
Yeah, this is really, I think, yes, an untold story. There's been some coverage of this during the election, but again, it got no real traction. But it's really, in terms of remote communities, social cohesion, and people's sense of hope, particularly of young people. This is really, an extraordinarily worrying statistic. Again, one needs to emphasise that this is about people participating in make work, not real work, and it's in fact diverting people from their aspirations to get on with creating a livelihood and engaging in ways of living and being that really match their aspirations.
So when you talk about make work, we are talking here about work that will not lead to concrete employment outcomes, work that is fictive, literally made up for the purpose of filling these allotted 5 hours a day. Is that correct?
That is correct. And in fact, another statistic that's shocking is that in terms of those serious breaches of 8 weeks, government has proven to be better at seriously breaching participants in this program than it has in creating 26-week outcomes at the rate of 2 to 1. So government's been more successful at breaching than in creating employment. And this needs to be contrasted with an older program, the Community Development Employment Program, where you actually gave community control. Employment was created in community, social and commercial enterprise. People were able to work extra hours, earn extra income, and always be paid at award rates. So I think one of the things we've got to remember is that under the current regime, people are being paid well below award rates, and frankly, they're resisting this, which is why you're seeing the high breach rates.
So moving forward now to the prospect of a new term of government, what needs to happen to actually make a difference? CDP, is this a salvageable policy?
Look, I think that there needs to be a fundamental rethink of the closing the gap framework, which is all about integration, but of people who often live in very different and difficult circumstances. But also what we need to do is to find ways to re-empower community. Going back to the old community development employment program, I think would be very useful. But we've also got to remember that in 2014, in the first hockey budget, $540 million was taken out of Indigenous specific programs. So in fact, again, in relation to the scorecard, what we're seeing is programs that are looking to address extreme Indigenous disadvantage being cut back. And so it's not surprising that this lack of resourcing has resulted in more deeply entrenched poverty. We've also seen cutting back of resources in terms for Indigenous representation. So the funding for the National Congress of Australia's First Peoples was cut back. And what we're seeing is progressive policy by the Australian Greens looking to refund that representation, because it's only through hearing about the aspirations and the solutions that Indigenous people themselves have to their deeply entrenched socioeconomic problems that we're going to see some governmental action that will actually be productive and progressive and will help to close this deeply entrenched poverty that's impacting on people's well-beings and ways of being.
This is not simply questions about statistics or numbers. These are lives, human lives, entire communities that are being affected by these policies. It's not simply about economic decision making, but really about the conditions that are required to encourage and facilitate the flourishing of human lives and good livelihoods.
Look, I think that we've had a decade-long project now of improvement for Indigenous people. Part of that's been under the umbrella of closing the gap. And as you say, Victoria, that's quite right. These gaps are all about statistics. But when you dig down and look at what's happening at the community level, you see that people not only are really suffering, but those gaps are just not closing. And that's why we need a fundamentally different approach, not one that's just about mainstreaming, but one that's actually looking for a diversity of approaches to deal with those diversity of Indigenous circumstances, particularly where people live remotely, have different values and aspirations, and have, sort of connection to country that's seeing them live in places where there are no mainstream opportunity. So whichever government gets into power after next Saturday, in my view, really needs to rethink its approach to Indigenous development and have an approach that is far more cognizant of those Indigenous aspirations and Indigenous circumstances. And that's how we'll in fact be able to at least address the poverty problem, if not eliminate poverty disparities in the short term.
Professor John Altman, thank you very much for joining us today.
Terrific to talk to you.